Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history in 20-minute episodes. I am your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of London Guided Walks. Find us on Twitter at guided_walks or Instagram at walk_London, or indeed we're also on Facebook and we're London Guided Walks. We have lots of lovely guided walks and private tours, treasure hunts, virtual tours, virtual treasure hunts for Londoners and visitors alike. You can check all of those out on our website, londonguidedwalks.co.uk. And don't forget, our blog is regularly updated with posts written by our passionate team of qualified London tour guides, and there are literally hundreds to choose from, all absolutely free. Thank you to everybody for supporting the podcast and listening to it. We have had over 22,000 downloads already. It's really quite amazing. If you enjoy the podcast, then please do write a review or at least click those 5 stars. I read everybody's comments and reviews and really do appreciate the time that it takes. If you like Charles Dickens, then you will enjoy our virtual tour. This is a recording of a live virtual tour I did for the paying public, and you're able to pay and play and watch it in your own time. And it looks at Charles Dickens and his works and his 48-year-old relationship with London. And you can get that on our website londonguidedwalks.co.uk and click on virtual tours. You can access the show notes for this episode on londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast, and then just hit on episode 40 to access those. And in there we also have recommended reading, and I'll include a few video clips and photos as well. But you are able to enjoy the podcast solely via audio. So, let's get on with today's theme, which is Charles Dickens in Greenwich. I've tried to include as many quotes from Charles Dickens as possible, and to help with the flow of it all, I have been assisted by London tour guide Ian McDermott, who will be the voice of Charles Dickens. The Victorian author Charles Dickens writes about Greenwich in a number of places, including magazines such as the Uncommercial Traveler and Household Words, and then also in some of his novels such as Bleak and Our Mutual Friend. And sometimes it's a small mention, like the smallest of smalls in David Copperfield, where our hero gave up the pursuit of the young man with the donkey cart and started for Greenwich, to full-scape descriptions of the fun of Greenwich Fair in Sketches by Boz and the goings-on in Our Mutual Friend. Greenwich and Greenwich Park became one of London's popular areas for leisure in the early 19th century. As the century progressed, Greenwich Park increased in popularity. This was in part due to the improved transport links. The new Greenwich Pier was built in 1836 and it welcomed day trippers coming via the Thames. The London and Greenwich Railway was opened in 1838, enabling people to venture from London Bridge along a 4-mile viaduct to Greenwich, London's first railway. Today, Greenwich has many attractions for the day tripper, and that could have been said in the 19th century, even though the attractions have changed somewhat. The Greenwich Fair was the big draw back then, and even though it had existed in one form or another since the early 18th century, it was at its height in the late 1830s and 40s. And a fleet of 50 steamboats would, with excited crowds from London, unloaded as many as 150,000 people a day. And don't forget the passengers who filled the first, second and third class train carriages too. There were 2 Greenwich Fairs, one at Easter and another at Whitsun. Dickens writes at length of the Greenwich Fair in his Sketches by Boz, which was an illustrative of the everyday life and everyday people, written in 1836 and 37. He mentions a wide variety of food available at the stalls, including pickled salmon with fennel,
oysters with shells as large as cheese plates,
and
diverse specimens of snail floating in a somewhat bilious-looking green liquid.
Lovely. Instead of the rides we would expect at a fair now, Greenwich Fair was unique, and it featured Greenwich Hill. It was also known as the Giant Steps, and it is on top of this that people would launch themselves. The more reckless individuals chose the steeper hill under the terrace of the Royal Observatory, and Dickens captured this frenzied free-for-all, known as tumbling, where young men would
drag young ladies up the steep hill which leads to the observatory and then drag them down again at the very top of their speed, greatly to the derangement of their curls and bonnet caps, and much to the edification of the lookers-on below.
Greenwich Fair does sound like it was a lot of fun.
Love-sick swains, under the influence of gin and water and the tender passion, become violently affectionate.
And we know that Dickens went to Greenwich several times when he was young, because he tells us.
In our earlier days, we were a constant frequenter of Greenwich Fair for years,
and writes about its frivolity with fondness.
The gentlemen promenading the gay and festive scene with the more expensive ornaments of false noses and low-crowned tinderbox-looking hats, playing children's drums and accompanied by ladies on the penny trumpet.
In Dickens's short story Greenwich Fair, he shares a scene with us.
If the parks be the lungs of London, we wonder what Greenwich Fair is. A periodical breaking out, we suppose, a sort of spring rash.
In 1835, a 13-year-old boy was caught stealing a handkerchief from the pocket of a respectable gentleman in the crowd. Does that sound like maybe a character that you know in Oliver Twist, which was written only 2 years later? In 1860 and 61, Dickens writes The Uncommercial Traveler, which is a collection of literary sketches, and he wanders the streets of London. And he also reminisces of his past. The Greenwich Pensioners were naval equivalents to the Chelsea pensioner, and they clearly left an impression on the young Dickens, as he describes the pensioner as having had a
checkered career of blue water, black gunpowder and red blood shed for England, home and beauty.
The pensioners were rather interesting individuals, and many clearly had a soft spot and also a reputation for the ladies. And they had a visible effect on the ladies too. Whenever a lady blushed, it was obvious,
without looking round, that a Greenwich pensioner has gone past.
Greenwich pensioners between 1705 and 1869 had lived in the Royal Hospital for Seamen, now called the Old Royal Naval College. They were pensioners. They wore a uniform of blue coats and tricorn hats. They lived within militarised rules and regulations, and any pensioner who was caught breaking those rules would have to wear a yellow coat and do menial tasks, and they were known as a canary. The townspeople of Greenwich nicknamed the pensioners the Greenwich Geese. I can only imagine how they got that name. Dickens also mentions St Elphage's Church in Greenwich in Our Mutual Friend, where he describes a wedding officiated by the mockingly titled Archbishop of Greenwich.
To see this salt old Gruff and Glum waving his shovel hat at Bella.
Old Gruff and Glum was the nickname for a charming old pensioner who had the
gallantry of a man of warsman and heart of oak.
Dickens's portrayal of the Greenwich pensioners seems to be a respectful and positive one. Even in Bleak House, the Greenwich pensioners get a mention.
Fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards. Fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper, down in his close cabin. Fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck.
Fog is used by Dickens on a number of occasions, sometimes to symbolise death and disease. Facing the River Thames, where the tea clipper, the Cutty Sark, now stands, was a tavern called The Ship, aptly named given the nautical connections of Greenwich. It was here where the happy couple, who had just wed at St Elphage's Church, had their wedding breakfast. And Dickens himself was known to have dined here with friends such as artist J.M.W. Turner. As Dickens was writing about the impoverished street children and society's solution in dealing with the poor, Turner was painting the Fighting Temeraire, voted England's favourite painting in 2004 by BBC Radio's For Today. You might recognise it as being in the National Gallery when James Bond, Daniel Craig, meets the new Q, Ben Winshaw, voice of Paddington Bear. I'll embed this snip in the show notes. The ship had undergone 4 incarnations since the 16th century. It was famous for its ministerial whitebait dinners, which marked the end of a Parliament session. It was an impressive Victorian tavern by the time that Dickens and Turner were eating there, with dining rooms named after heroes such as Nelson and Wellington. It had a ballroom lit by gas chandeliers designed for the Great Exhibition of 1851, 7 private rooms, and the all-important billiard room. The landlady was a successful businesswoman who knew how to make the most of an opportunity, and the popular whitebait dinners were that. They cost 2 shillings 6pence, and she would serve a total of 40 orders in a day, netting the gross take of £5, pardon the pun. The total cost of fish that she spent, well, that was 3 shillings and 6pence. So not a bad profit after all. And of course, after she had all the overhead, I think even Starbucks would appreciate her 2,000% profit. And I bet she paid taxes. Another lost Greenwich location mentioned by Dickens is the Dreadnought Hospital. The Siemens Hospital Society was founded in 1821 to provide medical care to merchant seamen and their dependents. Instead of a Victorian hospital as we would imagine it, with stone walls, tall ceilings, long lines and rows of hospital beds, well, this was something a little bit different. First off, the hospital was in a 50-gun, de-mast former naval ship, HMS Grampus, which was moored at Deptford. Within 10 years, the accommodation was inadequate, and so in 1831 the patients were moved to a 3-decker 104-gun ship called the HMS Dreadnought. And this was moored just off Greenwich Hospital, and we know Dickens visited the Dreadnought Hospital when he was a reporter in his early career. 26 years later, they moved to an even bigger ship, this time a 120-gun HMS Caledonia, which was renamed HMS Dreadnought. Patients were finally moved ashore to the infirmary block of the Greenwich Hospital when the block had become vacant in 1869, and it had 250 patients in 64 small-bedded wards with their own fireplaces. The hospital was renamed the Dreadnought Siemens Hospital, but the Dreadnought herself remained in use as an isolation unit up until 1872, and after that she was broken up. In Dickens's novel Dombey and Son, which follows the fortunes of a shipping firm owner, Dickens describes Captain Bunsby as having
had more accidents happen to his own self than the Siemens Hospital to all hands.
Dickens also mentions the Dreadnought in his weekly magazine, which were basically miscellanies of fiction, poetry and essays on varying subjects. It's called the Household Words, and also that was the predecessor of All the Year Round. And he reports how clean and orderly everything was, and he seems somewhat bemused at the idea of a warship being used to heal sailors.
These, within the bulwarks originally built for the purpose of smashing kind at large, they get tenderly doctored and nursed.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and got to know Charles Dickens, his works and Greenwich a little bit more. You can learn more about Charles Dickens and Greenwich in the show notes, where I'll link to other blog posts. But we also do a Greenwich walk, both a public tour when COVID is a far distant memory, and also a private tour which you can book us. And you can check all of that out in the show notes as well. londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast, and then click on episode 40. And if you haven't done so already, we've got lots of lovely episodes for you to listen to. That's all for now. I'll see you next week.